out of war so that we can save 5,000 people a week. And that's what my aim is.
It is clear that FBI is politicizing this situation to make an example of her and others across the country who oppose these attacks on the judicial system.
She put the lives of our law enforcement officers at risk. She put the lives of citizens at risk.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, the world, in the regal form of heads of state, is arriving in Rome for the funeral tomorrow of Pope Francis. That, in the strictest sense, is not news. But the global appraisal of Pope Francis's reign and his emphasis on outreach to the marginalized and dispossessed will bump uncomfortably into harsh rhetorical and governing reality across Christendom. Migration is viewed with suspicion or hostility in Europe and America, for sure. Aggressive application of laws in America have in recent weeks led to the jailing of undocumented immigrants, some with alleged criminal records, shipped to a maximum security prison in El Salvador, others to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Evidence of these alleged crimes, according to available court documents, has at times been credible, other times circumstantial, and still other times borderline conjecture. Today in Milwaukee, a judge was arrested for allegedly trying to help an undocumented migrant evade arrest by federal law enforcement officials. The FBI director cheered that arrest on social media. Meanwhile, court cases seeking the evidentiary or procedural basis for contested arrests and deportations, well, they grind on. Pope Francis was unequivocal up until his death about the need for Christians and the world to extend some manner of compassion to migrants, legal or illegal. This week in Washington, a federal task force was formed to investigate acts of anti-Christian bias. What Christians do or do not do to heed Pope Francis's call to help migrant populations may well flow through what it means to be a Christian in America. And a question for the future looms. Will authorities punish acts of assistance, even if carried out in the name of compassion? Pope Francis was, as we all know by now, the first non-European pope in 1,300 years. He presided over a Catholic flock that has seen its largest growth from 1975 occur not in Europe or America, but in Africa and Asia. Catholicism has been, for much of Francis's life, a globally migratory faith. That reality about migration and reactions to it must therefore intersect with the politics of our day and words soon to be spoken in hushed tones about Pope Francis. Words like legacy, impact, theology, and advocacy. We start tonight with Nancy Cordes at the White House and Aaron Navarro, who joins us from Rome. Nancy, let me start with you on the North Lawn. The president has arrived in Rome, and he suggested before leaving that he might have a kind of busy schedule, lots of meetings, but the time available, as I read the schedule, might not be there.
Right. It's a really quick trip. It's obviously packed with commemorations to the late Pope and his funeral service. And what the president just told reporters on Air Force One a short time ago was that he doesn't know that it's appropriate for him to actually schedule one-on-one meetings with various leaders while he is in Rome, even though it is technically his first overseas trip of his second presidential term. He said, you know, he might talk to them here and there when he sees them, but that he doesn't think that it would follow protocol to try to be setting up meetings and doing business when he's only going to be in Rome and at the Vatican for half the weekend.
Aaron Navarro in Rome. Can you set the scene for us a bit?
Yeah, President Trump will be here for about 14 hours and 36 minutes, according to when he's scheduled to leave and when he came in around 10:54 p.m. locally. And what we've seen from some of the foreign dignitaries leading up to today is there are a couple that say they want to meet with President Trump. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is looking to meet with Trump, and their potentially first meeting in his second term. And since President Trump launched a lot of targeted tariffs towards Europe, Ukrainian President Zelensky could potentially also be meeting with Trump. That's someone he said on Air Force One to reporters he's looking to meet with, though we'll see if his plans are in flux due to the strikes in Kyiv. But as Nancy mentioned, it could be pretty just casual during the sidelines of Pope Francis's funeral. And just here near St. Peter's Square, it's definitely gotten quiet as the visitors are not allowed to enter at this moment in the lead up to tomorrow's funeral. But certainly with President Trump and many other world leaders attending tomorrow, the scene will be busy, and we'll be watching, reading lips, watching seat assignments to see what these world leaders are saying to each other.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Back to you, Nancy, the North Lawn of the White House. Before boarding Marine One, President Trump was asked about talking to Chinese leader President Xi. Let's hear what he had to say.
You said you spoke with President Xi. Have you spoken to him since the tariffs? When did you last
I don't want to comment on that, but I've spoken to him many times.
So, Nancy, how I read that is, yes, they've spoken many times. That's a fact. The key fact, the unknown fact, has it happened since the tariff confrontation began?
Right. And the whole reason this came up, Major, is because the president made a very improbable claim in a new interview with Time magazine. He was asked if President Xi had called him to try to negotiate some way out of this massive tariff war that we now find ourselves in, with the U.S. imposing 145% tariffs on China and China imposing 125% tariffs on us. And President Trump responded, yes, he has called me. And the reason that's surprising is that, first of all, if Xi had called, we probably would have been alerted. And second, if President Xi had called, they would probably be in discussions now, because U.S. businesses are feeling a great deal of pain as a result of these tariffs. And what we have heard over and over again from the Chinese and from the Treasury Secretary and other White House officials is that there are no conversations going on at all. And that's why reporters pressed President Trump to explain exactly when did President Xi call you? And was it during this presidential term? Was it after you imposed the tariffs? And he simply said he didn't want to give any details, and he got onto Marine One, which appeared to some to be an effort to walk back that definitive claim he made in the Time magazine article in which he said that Xi had actually picked up the phone and tried to reach him.
It sounded like a walkback, and it looked like a walkback. Nancy, thank you so much. Aaron, back to you in Rome. Explain to the audience what the size of the crowd is expected to be tomorrow, the morning, how it's going to proceed through the funeral, and then what happens next.
Yeah, thousands are expected to be at this funeral tomorrow. And in the last couple of days, hundreds of thousands have been here as mourners to visit, quickly see the coffin of Pope Francis. And what's known as the conclave, and I'm sure some of the viewers may know that movie, is expected to happen weeks after this funeral. And it's a secret process, not necessarily a lot of the political meat grinding that we see in U.S. campaigns, but there certainly are cardinals advocating for one another, maybe advocating for one certain cardinal in particular. And you will see from the Vatican white smoke when they have made their choice for the next pope.
Aaron Navarro in Rome and Nancy Cordes, North Lawn of the White House. Thanks so very much. Now, to the FBI's arrest today of a Milwaukee judge accused of helping an undocumented migrant evade arrest. Here to discuss, Scott McFarland, Camilo Montoya Galvez. Scott, what happened?
At about 8 this morning, Central Time, the FBI went to the local courthouse in Milwaukee, where this judge sits, the circuit court, arrested her at the courthouse, then brought to the federal courthouse, where she was charged with felony obstruction, which is a U.S. code violation. The U.S. Marshals detained her in a holding area in the courthouse, booked her, took a mugshot, gave her an initial appearance. She's back May 15th for an arraignment where she'll have the opportunity to plead
Released
not
on her
guilty.
own recognizance.
Yeah, it's a nonviolent crime, released with little to no conditions. She can enter a not guilty plea at the arraignment, but that's not for a couple of weeks. A few different issues here. The allegations are that she knowingly, after saying it was absurd that immigration agents had come to her courtroom a week ago, then sent the immigration agents to her boss's office, the chief judge, then moved the defendant the immigration agents were there to get to a jury box seat, then out a door, a private hallway only jurors use, and after which the agents caught up after a foot chase with the defendant, arrested him for possible deportation. The feds say all of that sequence of events is felony obstruction. There's any number of flashpoints to this issue. This is going to pop out. But I think most fundamentally, there's an argument that arresting a judge is a provocative thing.
And what do we know about the individual at the center of this effort that the judge undertook and that immigration officials eventually arrested?
Yeah, according to the charging documents in the case, Mr. Flores Ruiz, Eduardo Flores Ruiz, was in the court last Friday on a domestic battery charge, a criminal case before the judge, Judge Hannah Dugan. He, according to the charging documents, was also ripe for deportation, that he was suspected of being in the country unlawfully and that he was flagged by a local Immigration and Customs Enforcement office for possible detention and deportation. What the Democrats who've responded to this, and there have been a lot of Democratic responses, is that arresting the judge on a criminal charge was unnecessary. It was an unnecessary, provocative move that threatens democracy, threatens the separation of powers, and sends a chilling message to other judges not to cross the president's priorities. You can expect this to manifest itself into something much larger than this judge or this domestic battery defendant.
Camilo, I want to pick up on a couple of other threads in the immigration space, and there are many this week, but today, some news on student visas and the Trump administration.
Sure. So just to level set, Major, over the past few weeks, the Trump administration has been revoking the student visa registrations of thousands of foreign students here in the U.S., including students who have had minor brushes with the law. Some cases have been dismissed, and they are arguing, the students are, that they are being unfairly targeted by the Trump administration as part of this broader crackdown on immigration that extends to people who are in the country lawfully and legally, not just people who are here illegally. And this record that is being terminated by ICE, or that was being terminated at some point, is what underpins their ability to study and live here in the country lawfully. And so these terminations prompted a lot of concerns among students and also universities and colleges, because they feared that they could be deported after this record was terminated. And this also triggered a flurry of lawsuits, dozens of them across federal courts in the country. Now, today, the administration has made a dramatic change in course, saying that it will reinstate the records, the registrations of these students that will allow them to continue to live here legally and study here legally. The caveat, Major, is that ICE is finalizing a policy to make these cancellations in a more formal way in the future. So this will not be the final say.
Okay. I also want to play for both of you. Our colleague Lilia Luciano had an interview with White House immigration czar Tom Homan. Let's listen.
I just want to read something that you said. In 2016, you said that people who are deported have already had a day in court. Their due process is over. You said that final order of removal needs to mean something. When people are deported under Title VIII, that means something. People are being deported without a judge's order. How is that different, and why shouldn't they have a due process?
Well, we're talking about two different things. What I said back there, we're talking about Title VIII. We never used Alien Enemies Act back when I made that statement. Alien Enemies Act is something we're using now. So they're two different processes. Alien Enemies Act isn't something we made up. Congress created the Alien Enemies Act, and they created it in such a way there's less of a due process structure.
The Federalist Congress created it under the presidency of John Adams, just for the record. And it was a wartime measure, and it has been used subsequently, rarely, and also under dire wartime scenarios. Camilo, evaluate that.
This is the first time that the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 is invoked during peacetime against a non-state actor. The statute says that this can be used during times of invasion or a predatory incursion by a nation or government. The administration is making this extraordinary legal argument that the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua is actively invading the U.S., and so suspected members of that gang can be summarily detained, arrested, and deported from the country. They have already invoked that law to send several dozen of these suspected members of Tren de Aragua to El Salvador, but we now know that their families, records, and investigations by 60 Minutes and others have found that many of the men sent there lack any criminal record, and that the gang accusations that they have faced are in some ways flimsy.
Scott, I want to go back to the Milwaukee judge, because that is a significant event in this larger conversation about Trump administration immigration policies. I want to play for you something that was on Fox News today with the Attorney General Pam Bondi. Let's listen.
When you see these judges trying to obstruct your efforts to make this country safer, what is your message to them?
We are going to prosecute you, and we are prosecuting you. You cannot obstruct a criminal case, and really, shame on her. It was a domestic violence case of all cases, and she's protecting a criminal defendant over victims of crime.
Scott, evaluate that.
I think some of the critics of this arrest today say you needn't have arrested the judge at her courthouse. You have a lower level felony case. You can send a message to the judge to have turn herself in with her defense lawyer at the office. You can have the judge appear at the courthouse
and
directly.
Of course, you know, some members of our audience, Scott, would say, well, the judge shouldn't have done what she did.
Yeah, I think what the allegation the attorney general made there was that she was interfering with a criminal case. I think, in fact, the allegation is she's interfering with an immigration case, and she was handling the criminal case at the local level. This is a proxy war now. Whether that was the intention or not, there is going to be a battle over whether this is an infringement on the separation of powers or whether this is a righteous move by the administration to ensure they can do what they say they were elected to do. You can just watch the political ramifications of this blossom in the days to come.
With context and clarity, as always, Camila Montoya Galvez, Scott McFarland, thank you. Quick programming note, you can see more of Lilia Luciano's interview with Trump administration board czar Tom Homan tonight on the CBS Evening News, 6:30 Eastern, right here. Well, not right here, but on CBS. That's the other thing, you know, it's 24/7. You got it all now. President Trump now open to the return of that wrongfully deported Maryland man to the United States. Well, he said some stuff about that. We're going to evaluate when we come back right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. What I'm about to read won't surprise you. President Trump says he has not asked the leader of El Salvador to return Kilmar Abrego Garcia to the United States. That's not really shocking. But the president made that comment in a lengthy 100 days interview with Time magazine. Interestingly, when asked about his refusal to bring back Abrego Garcia and how it's playing politically, the president said, quote, "I think this is another men in women's sports thing for the Democrats." Michael Schnell and Tom Lobianco, Michael Schnell and Tom Lobianco join me now. Michael is a congressional reporter for The Hill. Tom, founder and editor of 24 Site News. So, Michael, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Good to be here.
You've written extensively about House Democrats, as I understand mostly, maybe some Senate Democrats, how they're evaluating not only the conversation about immigration in the Trump administration, but about Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
Politically, this is such an interesting phenomenon because both parties seem to be leaning into this issue. Republicans, the NRCC saying, we'll send any House Democrat to El Salvador as long as they live stream the entire thing. House Democrats, Senator Chris Van Hollen, going to El Salvador to try and meet with Abrego Garcia. But there's starting to be this conversation and even debate within the Democratic Party of, is this the issue we should be leaning into? Is this worthy of our time at the moment? Now, nobody is questioning the constitutional concerns with President Trump not facilitating the return of Abrego Garcia, as the Supreme Court had said.
Due process, invoking state secret.
That's right.
All these sorts of things that are slow walking or borderline defying federal court orders in this matter.
Right. Nobody's questioning that. But once you get beyond that part of it, there are real questions of, are Democrats best spent with their time right now talking about a Maryland man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador, or should we be talking about kitchen table issues, the stock market tumbling, the rising cost of prices? We just had Easter when eggs was the foremost focus, and the price of eggs is higher right now. Should folks be talking about that? There's this developing debate within the Democratic Party, and it could increase and be more public in the coming days and weeks.
Tom, your sense of all this?
It reminds me so much, that answer, it's very classic Trump, where, later in that interview, he said, well, I don't know, I have to ask my lawyer, I go with what my lawyer says.
I might be open to it, bringing Kilmar Abrego Garcia back.
Maybe not. It reminds me so much, and, people who have been in and out of Trump world over a decade now of him in politics would always say this, he hates confrontation. And it's really remarkable, right? And, we talked about this before, the buck stops where? Well, my lawyer, maybe. Kind of depends upon what, Bukele says. I don't know.
The leader of El Salvador.
Yeah.
Bukele.
It was really shocking to me because, and it also relates to Ukraine here too, because it's like, well, okay, maybe not.
Right.
All right.
Speaking of Ukraine, I want to remind the audience with the miracle of sound bites we keep around in our archives from the campaign. What then candidate Trump said about what would happen if he won the election and Ukraine and Russia. Let's listen.
Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, shortly after I win the presidency, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled.
Settled. Well, just yesterday on social media, Vladimir, stop, was the social media post from the President of the United States, leader of the free world.
Not exactly high-level diplomacy, strategic deal-making here. I think, and it's really helpful to see how other nations are reacting to this, to see how Europe is reacting to this. Remember, it wasn't that long ago where you kind of had multiple fronts, and a lot of the European leaders were saying, look, if you want to deal with China, we have to deal with Ukraine first, because we are there. All right, this is our, we are right next to this. And you're starting to see, and you started to see this, months ago with that disastrous White House Oval Office meeting, where the European nations are starting to step in to handle this themselves. You're seeing arms deals, arms stocks in these European nations starting to go up. And in a global sense, it really starts to show what you saw with the President of the United States tweeting a scream. Right. Please.
Almost.
Yeah.
That was the only word that wasn't there. Please stop, Vladimir. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was implied. It was implied. Michael, George Santos was sentenced today. Our audience may well remember the sagas of short-lived member of Congress, Republican from New York, George Santos. Read us out on that.
7 years, 3 months behind bars. That's what the sentencing was. It was actually exactly what prosecutors had asked for. Prosecutors had argued that he wasn't remorseful, that despite pleading guilty, entering into this plea deal, they actually cited his social media posts.
Right, and saying in that pleading he was remorseful, then going on social media and
doing essentially the exact opposite. So George Santos on Long Island this afternoon, sentenced to that 7 years, 3 months. Such an interesting moment. The story of George Santos has been fascinating. He was elected to that New York district in November of 2022, seen as a Republican trailblazer, the first gay Republican to be elected as a non-incumbent in the House. For just weeks later, the New York Times breaking the story about his fabricated past and really everything unraveling from there, culminating with that December 2023 expulsion from the House, etching his name in history books as just the 6th person in the House to ever be expelled. So a fascinating story. I think a lot of folks are wondering now, is he going to be looking for a pardon from President Trump? He's been very effusive in his admiration for President Trump. He did give an interview to the New York Times yesterday. He said he wouldn't be seeking that out, but that's going to be the next saga, the next chapter to watch, rather, in this saga.
And Michael, it's worth recalling that when the allegations surfaced, and when the process was going on, both with federal prosecutors and the House Ethics Committee, Santos's denials were unequivocal,
that's right,
absolute, and very Trumpian.
Yes. He was not standing down. He was, in fact, standing up to the charges, saying, I'm going to have my day in court. I am going to fight this. But then, of course, a few months ago, he arrived back at that centralized slip courtroom, and he pled guilty.
And, Tom, a reminder, it seems to me, to all Republicans, there is one Trump and only one Trump.
Yes. The rules of gravity, the rule of law, applies.
Right.
Clearly. Yeah, you can't just go around saying you're Jewish, when you get called out on it, as Santos did, of course, famously. No, and that's this weird dichotomy because, I was looking at Santos, and it's, as Michael points out here, when you're under oath, you say one thing because you're under oath, presumably the truth, because there are repercussions for not speaking the truth under oath.
Perjury is one of the repercussions.
Yes. Yes. But then go on social media and completely contradict yourself, which could presumably be used in court again. And there's this, you see this in all levels of politics now. It's diffused throughout politics, where politics and performative politics is really divorced from reality. In a way that 10 years ago, I would argue even 5 years ago, was not the case.
And there are risks involved to wagging, rather, a disdainful finger in the face of prosecutors on social media because they have an answer back. They get a chance to talk to the judge about what may or may not happen to you. And George Santos today found out. Michael Schnell, Tom LoBianco, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Happy weekend. Coming up, interesting week on Wall Street, kind of up, kind of down, mostly up. We'll dig into the numbers and much more, including on consumer sentiment. That's next right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Happy Friday to everyone. U.S. stocks finished today kind of flat, but up for the week as investors tried to assess and draw inferences from what may or may not be happening on the tariff front, trade deal front, all of it revolving around what the Trump administration is or isn't going to do with the future of the global economy as it relates to trade and tariffs. For more, I want to bring in CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady. Kelly, always great to see you. We'll talk about stocks in a minute. I want to talk about the consumer sentiment numbers today because there's an interesting story there. Tell us what it is, and then we're going to talk about the more interesting story within those numbers about expectations, especially for those who define themselves living in America's middle class. But first things first.
Yeah, look, I mean, the story was bad, but better than expected, which I think in this environment was some welcome relief. Consumer sentiment was down more than 8% versus last month. But again, we kind of expected it to be a little bit worse. But really what seemed to make the change in the data is that this survey included April 9th, data from April 9th, of course, which was the day that the White House paused those reciprocal tariffs. But generally, it's still pretty bad. Consumers think that inflation is going to be 6.5%. And we saw versus January a 32% drop in that expectations index, kind of what people expect the economy to look like. We haven't seen a drop that big since the 1990 recession. And of course, that goes back to when the president started in office back in January, Major.
And that expectation metric matters because in historical terms, it tends to be, if not an absolute predictor, a rough predictor of future behavior, does it not?
That's absolutely right. I mean, it can also be an indicator, by the way, for a recession. I don't say that word lightly, but it has been an indicator. And that is because when consumer sentiment is poor, you start to see a place where consumer spending drops significantly. Now, that doesn't always happen, but if consumers feel like things are bad, they might start to react that way.
Thanks so much. President Trump, as was indicated by Aaron Navarro earlier in this very fine program, touched down in Rome for Pope Francis's funeral. That unexpected trip and what could happen on the sidelines, plus lots of other political news to digest this week. Our political panel will help us do exactly that when we come back. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. Week began with the Pope's death. Very, very big surprise. He'd celebrated Mass the day before. No one expected it. And certainly not in the same order of magnitude. There were some surprises in the United States Senate and a fair amount of internal drama within the Democratic National Committee. Here, briefly, is a look at the week that was.
It's pretty crazy, actually. And obviously, when I saw him, I didn't know that he had less than 24 hours still on this earth. I think it was a great blessing.
I'm announcing today that I will not be seeking re-election at the end of my term.
I'm Andy Barr, and I'm running for Senate to help our president save this great country.
Let me be unequivocal. No DNC officer should ever attempt to influence the outcome of a primary election, whether on behalf of an incumbent or a challenger.
Joining me now at the table, Mara Gillespie, former advisor to both Speaker of the House John Boehner, former Speaker of the House, of course, and former Congressman Adam Kinzinger, and Chuck Rocha, newly minted as a CBS News political contributor. Mara, you're minted as well. He's just newly minted. That's all.
Newly. All the new face.
So as a newly minted contributor,
here we go.
Chuck, here we go.
Sound smart.
Let's get it on. Dick Durbin, not seeking re-election, a surprise to no one.
Right.
Important figure, but there's going to be a mad scramble in Illinois to replace him.
I was on the phone with folks in Illinois today, and there's a lot of folks thinking about running, and folks that are calling me that nobody's talking about. So there's probably going to be, let me use my fancy word, a plethora of candidates from the three amigos.
That's what happens when you become a newly minted CBS News contributor.
Yes. Talk to Ed
we give
O'Keefe
a
and
small
Finn Gomez.
dictionary with big words.
There's a plethora of folks running, and a lot of folks from every side of the aisle. So what's really interesting is what kind of Democrat? This is a safe seat. Whoever wins the primary will win. Will it be a conservative Democrat? Will it be a white Democrat? Will it be a black Democrat? Will it be all shapes and forms of Democrat? It's really going to be interesting to watch from the outside because more importantly than winning this election will be the election to replace him in the Senate, who will be the heir apparent to Chuck Schumer.
Exactly. And related to that, Maura, I promise we're going to get to you, but this DNC drama I referred to in the open. David Hogg, who sat here last week and talked about a $20 million effort that he would be willing to undertake as a vice chairman within the Democratic National Committee to primary and seek the defeat of asleep at the wheel House Democrats. And I said, can you name me one? He said, no, I hope the ones who know who they are will bow out. Right. Dick Durbin is in the Senate. I'm not saying he's an asleep at the wheel Democrat, but he is of that seniority that suggests he doesn't have what it takes to carry on for this moment. David Hogg is talking about that. We heard the new chairman of the Democratic National Committee saying unequivocally, you cannot do that. This is injurious to what the party's trying to accomplish. What is your take on what David Hogg is up to?
I watched your interview, and I thought that you pushed him hard, and I thought that was the right thing to do because we want to know what is the details of this. If you're going to get $20 million, wouldn't that be better spent as a DNC officer against Republicans? If you really want to change this party, it's not the candidates. It's the folks behind the candidates who haven't changed in 50 years. Change a few of those folks. Get some younger consultants, some newer ideas, and we'd probably start doing more videos on the TikToks or over on the Instagrams.
As a Republican, Maura, how do you watch this DNC internal feud?
It's great news for Republicans. I mean, quite frankly, if you're going to go after, you are in a minority. You don't have a single, leadership position essentially to have a seat at the table in terms of branches of government, and you're going to use $20 million to go after your own and make your minority even smaller.
Cannibalize your own
But you're
party.
basically making that a smaller number. Why would you do that? So it's great for Republicans because they're going to see that and go, we don't need to spend money there. They're going after their own. That's great for Republicans. But
is there any possibility that you knock out someone who is not as feisty, not as aggressive, and that Democrat who wins in that contest could be a more formidable person?
And maybe that is, but the strategy...
That's David Hogg's perspective.
For sure, but the strategy behind it is just deteriorating what's already a very confused Democratic Party. They don't have a leadership to look to. They don't have one particular person that they're saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's the path forward. Here's how we're going to identify new voters and to get people on board. And it makes me think of when, John Boehner was Speaker and he was a prolific fundraiser. But he had a policy about getting involved during primary races.
Don't do it.
Don't do it. He felt very strongly about it, as you recall. And it was because why set up divisions within the party structure itself.
Right. You've got to row in the same direction.
Correct.
It's hard enough to win. Yeah. Let me ask you about what's confronting House and Senate Republicans in the next couple of weeks, because they have to make really discernible progress on the reconciliation package. The president calls this one big beat, whatever. That's what he calls it. It's a big piece of legislation with lots of tax cuts and other things in it. It has been general. Now it needs to get specific, and some hard choices need to be made.
And they're hearing from their constituents. They're going home and they're having these town halls and they're hearing the concerns. You're seeing it in poll numbers that things are starting to slip a little bit. So while they still are doing better than, Trump numbers are better than Joe Biden's were when he was president, but they are slipping. So I think Republicans need to be looking at that. They need to be listening to their constituents at home and saying, how are we going to get through this Medicare conversation, this Medicaid conversation that Democrats are going to lobby at them?
Chuck. Every election cycle, there's a big piece of legislation that we make TV commercials about. We will make commercials against Republicans on every single detail of the plan you're describing. It will be the bedrock of the way Democrats say, this is the difference between us and Republicans. You've covered the ads forever of us taking grandma in a wheelchair and saying they're going to cut that Social Security. You better get grandma out there to vote. This will be the kind of details that we want to see to make ads to say they're not with you, they're trying to cut all this stuff, and we're with you.
How big a deal was it from your perspective, Chuck, then you, Maura, that Elon Musk on an earnings call with Tesla investors this week said his visibility, his role in the Department of Government Efficiency is going to reduce dramatically? Is that a political moment or just an economic moment?
I think it's a little of both. I think when you are a stockholder, and that's who he was talking to, and you see such a plunge, you have to give them something. And I think that was him. Whether he steps out right now or 3 months from now, he needed to tell them he's going to step back, I think, to save his own hide.
And Maura, do you think the Doge story is nearing its conclusion?
So initially, they were supposed to end on July 4th of 2026. It does seem as though that the appetite for what Doge has done thus far is waning, and even within White House conversations and in the public space. And again, with Tesla being where it's at, I think that he both President Trump and Elon Musk need to dial it back.
And a couple of level-setting numbers. The goal was $1 trillion in federal savings. I think they may reach, and I'm not suggesting that $100 billion isn't serious money. $100 billion is serious money. I'm not sure they're going to get there, but that's sort of where they are. Maybe 100, maybe 150 when it all shakes out. If it all shakes out, and there's a huge if there, that's a big gap.
But the issue has been from the start was that the operation of the Doge entity was to provide recommendations to the different departments and give them a way
not
to
operate the
not to
saw
just go
yourself.
in there, cut it out themselves, but they were supposed to go in there and say, here's where you can make cuts to provide more efficient operations here in this department, and here's how you could do it here, or here's how you can take USAID, and this was never a suggestion, but I think they should have done something where you take USAID and put it under the umbrella of the U.S. State Department, make it an arm of diplomacy. There are things they could have done that they just didn't do.
Very rarely do I get outside of this bubble and leave my house on Capitol Hill, but today I had to drive my truck out to drop off a fly rod out at Tyson's Corner, and when I was there, bringing it back to this Doge thing, there were folks standing on the corner in Tysons, Virginia saying, Elon Musk has your Social Security number. They were protesting Elon Musk on a Friday afternoon on the side of a busy interstate. I'm like, something's going on here if folks are just standing out here on a hot Friday afternoon in Virginia saying, Elon Musk has your Social Security number.
Chuck, you're going to get the last word on this because we had a conversation at this table with Scott McFarlane and Camila Montoya Galvez about the politics of the immigration conversation. What's your gut sense of it where it is right now?
I think it's moving away from Donald Trump. He has went after and after and after this to where now people were all about getting bad people out of the country, but now they're not about folks stepping around due process. And for the first time in a Fox poll today, he's underwater on the immigration issue.
Mara, quickly.
It's exactly what Chuck said, is that it is starting to wane with people. They are concerned about how far the line goes, where does the line end, and what happens when it starts to impact them personally now and down the road.
Mara Gillespie, Chuck Rocha.
Thank
Newly
you.
minted.
Newly minted.
Always minted. Mara Gillespie.
Thank you.
Triple T, that's Trump, tariffs, and Trudeau. How that trio is helping push the number of Canadians casting a vote to record highs ahead of Monday's election. We'll head north next, where Global News' Mercedes Stephenson is standing by with the latest on that very important Canadian election. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to Canada Decides. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. However, it's important. On Monday, Canadians, our beloved allies and friends to the north, will head to the polls to vote for the next ruling party, and in turn, a prime minister. Already, early voting has shattered records. Several parties are vying for a seat at the table, but here's the important part. One of these two men is likely to be the next prime minister. Mark Carney, the new leader of the Liberals, he replaced Justin Trudeau, or Pierre Poilievre and his Conservatives. Mercedes Stephenson joins me now. She's the Ottawa bureau chief for Canada's Global News and joins us from, I believe, Toronto. It's great to have you with us. Handicap where the race stands now and where it's heading.
It is a tight race, which frankly no one was expecting, because coming into this, the Conservatives had a 20-point lead over the Liberals. What changed? Well, the Liberals got a new leader right before the election was called, and he has made tremendous gains throughout this, particularly around the issue of Donald Trump and tariffs. Going into these final days, we really don't know who's going to win. The Liberals have managed to pull ahead, but the polls have appeared to be tightening. The question is, are they tightening in the right places? The way that the Canadian system works, particularly major urban cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, play an outsized role in who gets elected. And in those cities, the Liberals are doing much better. The question is there hidden support like you saw in the U.S. election for Donald Trump that is not showing up in the polls that could manifest itself on Election Day? Or are the Liberals still ahead in especially those key areas that will decide it? But at this point, it really is a tight race, and no one is sure where it's going to go, even though a lot of folks are saying kind of the Liberals to lose. The reality is, I know very few people who are comfortable, who cover this stuff, making a strong bet on who might be the winner on Monday night.
And Mercedes, you might well have mentioned the magic word in this race, Trump.
Yes. It's, I've covered a lot of elections, Major. I've never seen one focused on foreign policy. This is unheard of in Canada. Like, we're not a big military power. We don't talk about national defense or foreign affairs very much. The last election that was remotely similar would have been 1988, when we were talking about negotiating NAFTA. The central issue of this election, which no one could have predicted even a few weeks out before it, is who is the best person to handle Donald Trump. And that's, of course, because he is openly speculating about making Canada the 51st state. And I think a lot of Americans assume Canadians see it as a joke. They don't. It's taken very seriously up here. People are very upset by it. They're very concerned about our sovereignty. And of course, we're hugely reliant on the United States militarily and economically. So it really has become the big issue. And that's part of what blew that conservative lead. They were around issues like crime and affordability, which are huge issues here in Canada, just as they are in the US. Lots of people talking about them, but it's no longer the central issue. That has been replaced with Donald Trump.
And it seems like this campaign also has an interesting dynamic in this sense. Mark Carney is saying, if I gather it, I'm not Justin Trudeau. And Pierre Poilievre is saying, I'm not Trumpist. I'm my own person. They're both saying they're their own person, yet living in the politics of an umbrella of their, in Mark Carney's case, the Justin Trudeau Liberal Party, or in Pierre Poilievre's case, the idea that he's Trumpist and therefore kind of radioactive.
I think you're making such an interesting point there, and it's true. I mean, how many racists do you see to be the head of a government in a country that are based around who you're not instead of who you are? And that is really what these two contenders are dealing with. In the case of Mark Carney, he has to distance himself as far as possible from Justin Trudeau, who is basically political toxicity defined up here. Liberal or conservative people were very angry with Justin Trudeau when he left office. Mark Carney has, in fairness, been differentiating himself in a number of significant ways. While he has largely the same team, which is something the conservatives attack him around, he has changed the policies. In fact, he's stolen a number of the conservatives' policies, essentially. He's moving the party back to the center, sort of the business liberals versus the more socialist approach that the previous liberals had taken with bringing in things like pharmacare, dental care, which made them very popular with some folks. But those are not traditional liberal policies here. Now, the conservatives, you have Pierre Poilievre, who has looked and sounded a lot like Donald Trump on issues, desperately trying to distance himself from that, because that is the last thing that Canadians want to vote for when they feel that the country is potentially under threat. So he has spent a lot of time saying, I'll be tough on Donald Trump. The difficulty with Pierre is that sometimes the approach looks similar. So, for example, they choose the media questions. We're only allowed 4 questions a day and no follow-ups. We're not allowed to walk around at the rallies and talk to people. So in the same way that both of them are saying, I am not this other person, there are similarities and there are differences. The question I think ultimately Canadians will be answering is who they trust to negotiate with Donald Trump or try to protect the country if that negotiation is impossible.
Great conversation. Excellent perspective. Mercedes Stevens, I know it's going to be a long weekend and a long election night. Thank you so much for your help. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That does it for today. I will be back with another edition of America Decides. It's America Decides, not that Canada thing. I was just joking. Monday, 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report. You know it, you love it. Coming up next, right here on CBS News 24/7. Have a good weekend.